Hello, my fellow geeks. You are listening to the Indian AvGeek, and my name is Vishal Mehra. The new US administration has raised hopes of an end to the Russia Ukraine conflict. And no, this is not a politics based podcast, but one of the more important beneficiaries and obvious beneficiaries of that would be the aviation industry, severely impacted by the Russian airspace closure. And I thought this would be a good time to discuss the India US air travel market. My old friend Vinay Bhaskara seemed like an obvious choice. Vinay has been closely associated with aviation for a long time, starting with Bangalore Aviation, Aspire Aviation, and then a senior business analyst with the Airways magazine. He's also been the host of the Airways podcast and has been running an AI focused firm, College Vine, as a co-founder for the past 10 years. It makes perfect sense to start with a couple of questions on AI and aviation together. But first, Vinay, welcome to the Indian AvGeek.
Thank you so much for having me, Michelle.
We just mentioned that you run an AI startup. And by AI, I mean artificial intelligence and not Air India. Where all do you see aviation and artificial intelligence coming together across airlines and airports?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So, I mean, maybe the first thing that I'll say is that, AI has already had pretty large permeability and sort of like dispersal within the aviation industry, right? Because so when people say the word AI, right, you're really using it to sort of amalgamate two different concepts. The first is traditional like machine learning and data analysis and sort of like big data, I guess, if that term makes sense, right? And then the second is the sort of much more recent rise of generative AI models, things like ChatGPT, Claude, Anthropic, DeepSeek most recently, right? And so machine learning has a really, really long history of use in the airline industry. They were amongst the first industries, in fact, to really do a bunch of number crunching, a bunch of data analysis, using machine learning to set pricing strategy, frequent flyer strategy, et cetera. So AI already has and plays a pretty big role in the global airline industry. I think what's new really in the last couple of years is generative AI, right? And not just generative AI, but sort of a related concept called agentic AI, right? Which is really AI systems that operate within organizations and on workflows like employees, right? Where not only are you using AI to generate content, write an email, write a text, but actually take over a workflow or work alongside a team to take on complete tasks, right? So in the context of the airline industry, stuff like customer service, sales, sort of marketing, right? These are the types of things that have historically been done primarily by human labor. And I think there's a lot of potential for generative AI and really agentic AI to step in and either replace or supplement a lot of human labor in those workflows. And so the classic use case here is something like, think about the sort of workflow or the like process that you go through when you're trying to change your flight or make adjustments to your seat selection or whatever, right? Where you have to call into the airline. Sometimes in a place like India, you even have to go in person to a counter and get a human staff member to go into the booking engine, into the backend systems, and get something updated for you. With generative AI, especially now that you have the capability to not only go to ChatGPT and sort of chat with a chatbot, but today's sort of AI systems, and this is what I do in my day job, obviously in a very different industry, they can talk to you on the phone, they can text message with you, they can email with you. That has the potential to be pretty transformative to how airlines serve their customers, how they invest in the customer experience, and frankly, how they operate. Now, I think, we're a ways away from being able to have like planes, for example, that are flown automatically by AI systems without any human pilots in the loop. That type of thing is still, potentially decades away. But when it comes to the like operations and really the customer facing operation, I think increasingly more and more of that is going to be either partially or in some cases completely run at least at the frontline level by AI employees instead of human employees.
Few quarters back, Vinay, there was plenty of chatter around NDC that American Airlines was trying to implement, eventually resulted in Vasu Raja losing his job. Do you see reservation systems, global distribution systems becoming smarter with the inclusion of artificial intelligence?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So the way I would describe what agentic AI really unlocks, and again, we are very much in the early days of this. So part of the, I guess, vision that I'm laying out here is what does the airline industry look like in 2030 or even 2035, right? Like it's going to take some time to build up to this point. Um, but if you think about what agentic AI really enables for a business or for an organization, it is the ability to bring on skilled and really semi-skilled labor capacity um, at a much lower cost. And so if you think about today's sort of reservation systems and today's distribution and sales systems, right? A lot of the time, what makes those systems so painful is that you need like a human, usually a software developer or an IT worker, to go in and program changes and make adjustments. Like moving data around, making tweaks to policies and back-end programming. All of that type of work is the type of work that can be either automated or at the very least augmented by these types of AI systems that I'm talking about. And so, yeah, I do absolutely think that on a 5 or a 10-year time frame, you absolutely could see, you know, the very mechanics of how this industry goes out to its customers and generates revenue reshaped and transformed. Now, one thing that's worth noting there is part of the challenge is that there are some legacy structural factors that will slow down sort of the adoption of the technical possibilities, right? Even if you look at the whole NDC saga that American experienced, the sad part for American is that they were right and correct that NDC is going to be better in the long run, both for their actual end customers, i.e., the passengers that are flying on the planes, but even arguably for a lot of the sort of like travel agents and travel agencies that are plugging into the NDC system, right? It ultimately makes it easier for them to deliver value as the sort of middlemen between the airline and the end consumer, usually like a company or a managed corporate travel practice, right? But the problem is that there's a lot of existing sort of, labor and companies and frankly businesses that are built on the existing system, and so they were resistant to the change. And American, I think, flew too close to the sun in terms of how aggressively they tried to not
Yeah.
only shift everyone over to NDC, but then also bring down the sort of like margin or markup that these sort of middlemen were able to take from the system. And
Yeah.
so it kind of blew up in their face.
Yeah.
But yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, uh, on a
I
five or
think
a 10-year
United
timeline.
also, yeah, I think United also has been testing NDC, but they've been very gradual, very slow. And I think they're taking their B2B travel partners along instead of just, telling them, guys, this is what we do from tomorrow. I think it's slightly more gradual. So you don't hear that level of bad PR which really came out of American coming out from United or other airlines for that matter. Right. You mentioned about the impact of AI and on airlines. What about airports, Vinay? Do you see, some positive value coming out there as well?
Absolutely, but I think the time horizon is longer, right? So if you think about the roles that I've really called out, so back end reservations, processing, customer service. In today's world, these are mostly virtual jobs. They primarily are a human being and a computer or a telephone, right? On either end, right? So like a human being on either end with a computer or a telephone or a software system kind of mediating that interaction. That's the type of thing that it's relatively easy to build an AI system to take over. I think in the context of an airport, yeah, there are certain systems where, AI and agentic AI are going to make things more efficient or more productive or build in more backstops. But I do think that like on a fundamental level, something like baggage handlers or security screening agents, right? Like there is still a sort of like humans existing and operating in the physical world constraint that I think we are much further away from hitting that inflection point on.
All right, let's change the altitude a bit. How's the market between India and US right now? Obviously dominated by Air India due to geopolitical reasons. But what's your read, Vinay?
Yeah, I mean, I think the market is really, really interesting because there's sort of almost like uh, a couple of sort of tailwinds that are coinciding right now that are causing the market to grow, paired with a couple of interesting headwinds that could emerge across the next couple of years, plus a headwind that exists today, right? So, kind of my overarching view on the market is the long run potential is only up and to the right, and that is a function of the sort of continued growth, both in terms of volume and in terms of economic heft of the Indian diaspora within the United States, of which my parents are a part, and millions and millions of families are a part. And that's a cohort of working professionals mostly that has been sort of growing in terms of household incomes, in terms of where they are on the corporate ladder, right? Obviously, there's all the Silicon Valley companies that have Indian American CEOs or Indian sort of origin CEOs. But you even have, if you go a couple levels down to like the VP level or the C-suite level, there are tens of thousands of high level corporate sort of like Indian Americans or Indian origin individuals serving in those types of corporate roles. And that sort of translates to increased economic heft, right? And obviously, this is a group of people that have kept pretty strong ties to India as their homeland. So I think that sort of trend is only going to continue to accelerate, right? Even if net new immigration from India to the US shut off tomorrow, you would still have that diaspora and even the sort of kids and the first generation children of that diaspora continuing to become more and more economically relevant and fuel more and more underlying demand for travel to India. The other sort of tailwind that exists is as India's economy continues to sort of move up the value chain in software and in broader services, the economic links between the two countries are continuing to grow on a longer run time horizon. And I think this has been a little bit more choppy, right? I think the sort of earliest wave of US companies outsourcing to India for things like customer support or call centers has peaked and to some extent is starting to reverse in many cases because a lot of US companies have sort of recognized or concluded that there are limits to the cost savings and you tend to face some trade-offs in terms of customer satisfaction with some of that. Plus, I think that's the type of work that agentic AI is increasingly going to take over from human staffing. But the broader sort of economic ties between the US and India only continue to increase and improve, particularly with higher value added work in the tech sector. And India, in its own right, particularly Bengaluru, has become more and more of a sort of tech industry hub. So those are the things that I think are the tailwinds, right, that are fueling longer run growth in the sector. Right. And the way that you see this tangibly represented is when you look at sort of unserved markets between the US and India, a market like Dallas Fort Worth to Hyderabad is 3 times the size in terms of daily origin and destination passenger travel demand as a market like Dallas Fort Worth to Amsterdam, right, which is a historic, global, important European aviation hub. Right. There
Wow.
are enough passengers traveling, that travel per day between DFW and Hyderabad to fill 2/3 of a Boeing 787. And that's with no service in the market, and thus none of the stimulation that you get once you actually have nonstop scheduled service. And
That
again,
makes one
DFW,
wonder how come there's no service right now between those two markets. And especially knowing that the current Indian civil aviation minister is from Hyderabad and has been pushing expansion of Hyderabad international links.
yeah, for sure. Well, the reason is that comes back to our second challenge, which is and really the biggest headwind, which is the Russian aerospace problem, right? So DFW to Hyderabad, even without sort of Russian aerospace restrictions, is a very, very long flight, right? So I'm just going to look it up real quick here, but like that is an ultra long haul flight, right? DFW to Hyderabad. The exact distance here is in miles is 8,968 miles. In kilometers, it would be almost 14,000
Yeah,
kilometers. So it's an
that's a
ultra long
ULH.
haul.
That's a
That's a
ULH.
ULH, right? And there's not that many aircraft that can operate it, right? Certainly not in American Airlines, who's obviously the behemoth that dominates DFW as a market.
DFW.
Its
Yeah.
fleet. Air India hypothetically could fly a 777-200LR between the two cities. But the other problem is that most of that market is visiting family and relatives, right? It's about the diaspora to diaspora connections.
So,
Dallas is
so
just
the
not
yield
as much
won't
of
be
it.
as strong, especially for front of the cabin.
Right. Though the fact that the diaspora is getting so much more sort of economically affluent and well off does mean that over time, you are starting to see more and more of the sort of like going back home to visit family and friends in India traffic start to buy up into business class, right? If you are a corporate executive, your spouse is a physician, right? And you're now in your 50s, you could probably afford to
Yeah.
pay for business class, particularly given that Air India tends to price pretty aggressively on some of these routings. So I
Well,
think over time, maybe that gets better, but
yeah, but if let's say Air India starts a route to DFW, it will be from Delhi because they are really building up Delhi as their primary international hub. There has been talks of DFW opening. I've read LinkedIn posts where Air India is trying to recruit people for DFW and LAX. So
right.
if it opens, I guess for people in Hyderabad, it'll have to be, if they want to travel on Air India, it'll have to be Hyderabad, Delhi, Delhi, DFW. And that's why, I guess that's why so often, Vinay, passengers in South India, I guess, prefer a Middle East carrier because
Right. Absolutely.
they don't have to, travel back. It's a good enough break in the journey about 3 hours in for them. And then there is another 10, 11 hours, whatever, instead of, 14 hours at a stretch. That's what it's turning out to be. But we'll see how geopolitics, like you're saying, how it would also really shape up these connections and really impact the market.
So DFW to Delhi is about 15% shorter. So it actually is flyable, even with the Russian airspace deviations in a way. Sorry, it's flyable without being so ultra long haul, right? It's actually shorter than some routes that currently operate, places like, things like San Francisco to Singapore, which United flies on a, standard configured 7879. The interesting thing, though, is that yes, Air India is going to launch from Delhi because that is their hub, and that's the strategy, is to build up Delhi as a hub. But the market from Hyderabad to DFW is actually 50% larger in terms of daily passenger traffic than the market from Delhi to DFW.
All right. Let me help you take out your crystal ball. Which new routes are US based airlines planning to introduce to India in the near future?
Yeah, so it's a great question, right? Because I think there's sort of two answers, right? There's the answer of what's going to happen if Russian airspace restrictions continue for US carriers. And then there's the question of what happens if Russian airspace restrictions sort of go away, right? And so one of the questions now that we are in a new presidential administration in the US is, does the posture between the US and Russia change in any way? Does the Ukraine conflict get resolved in some form or fashion such that Russian airspace reopens? So first, if Russian airspace doesn't reopen, I think truthfully, not much. You would have Delta, I think at some point, once it takes delivery of its A350-1000s, is going to launch service from JFK, probably to Delhi, maybe to Mumbai, right? Delta has historically had sort of more strength in the Mumbai market versus Delhi. United is and American kind of in the opposite, where they've had historically more strength flying into Delhi. That's pretty much it, right? Like I could see, Delta adding nonstop service from JFK, right, which is obviously its sort of New York flagship hub, into at least one, maybe two Indian markets. If United gets sort of higher gross weight 787s, or they get a more premium configuration, you could maybe see them re-add or restart Newark to Mumbai. That's about it prior to Russian airspace restrictions going away, because it just fundamentally creates such a long deviation that both the economics of the flight become untenable because you're burning way more fuel, and nonstop markets that are possible if you fly through Russian airspace become impossible, right? It's possible to fly SFO to BLR with a 787 as United was planning to, um, or SFO to Delhi, when you can fly through Russian airspace, but you can't do that if you have to deviate by a couple thousand miles, or at least 1,000+ miles when Russian airspace is closed. So I think that's kind of the answer for like prior to a change in the Russian airspace posture.
There was talk of Alaska doing Seattle, Bangalore, mentioned in their recent Investor Day presentation. Do you see that happening, Vinay?
Yep, exactly. So then you get into the category of what might airlines do once Russian airspace reopens. And then I think there you will actually see a gold rush because right now Air India is minting money, even adjusting for the standards of that carrier, which is going through obviously a transformation and a restructuring, is minting money because it has a monopoly on a lot of these markets. I think once Russian airspace reopens, all bets are off. So right off the bat, I think United immediately restarts Newark to Delhi. Newark to Mumbai. I think it adds Newark to Bengaluru. I think it adds SFO to both Delhi and Bengaluru, and then probably Chicago to Delhi. So right off the bat, there's like 5 additional routes. You might even see them add service from Washington Dulles to Delhi, both to serve the Indian diaspora in sort of Washington and Northern Virginia, but then also because they're increasingly trying to position Dulles as more of the connecting hub in the Northeast, with Newark more to serve New York area origin and destination. So I think there's a lot of potential for United. This is, and United historically has been the largest US carrier in the US India market, right? Then I think from the perspective of Delta, there I think the potential is a little bit smaller just because if you look at where Delta's hubs are located, obviously New York, JFK, I think plenty of route potential there. Delhi, Mumbai are no brainers. You could maybe see them add service to Bengaluru. But then the rest of their hubs, Atlanta, um, uh, Detroit, Minneapolis. Yeah, all these towns have Indian diasporas. Like that is one thing that is different than the sort of even relative to the pre-pandemic sort of era. Atlanta has a meaningfully sized Indian community. Detroit has actually for a long time had a meaningfully sized Indian community. So you could see them maybe add Atlanta to Delhi or potentially DFW to Detroit to Delhi. But I think there's less potential just because their hub network isn't as oriented in the huge sort of centers of Indian population. And then I think American is kind of the last one, and they're really interesting because DFW is probably the 3rd biggest sort of Indian diaspora city in the US today, right? You've got sort of the New York, New Jersey kind of duo. You've got the San Francisco Bay Area, obviously hugely important, both from a population perspective and then also the tech industry links between India and the US. Dallas is probably sort of like the 3rd largest poll these days, right? And I actually live in Dallas, so this is something I've seen firsthand, right? We have a joke where we call Dallas DALLASpuri because there's so many Telugu people, right? My family's Telugu origin
That's a
that have
good
moved
one. That's a good one. Yeah.
have moved into DFW yet, right? And so I think they have a lot of potential to add service from DFW. They obviously have a hub in Chicago, which was maybe historically the 2nd or 3rd most important sort of in Indian diaspora city. And then I think of the carriers in LAX, because remember, LAX is kind of weird because it has this sort of tripartite 3-way fight between United, Delta, and American, who all operate hubs there. And then Alaska actually has a pretty big presence that's only going to grow now that they've merged with Hawaiian. So LAX is interesting because none of the carriers have been able to turn it into like a connecting hub, even though there's tons and tons of demand. And so I think someone will try LAX to Delhi at some point. But it's sort of a toss-up between the 3 carriers in terms of what they do. So yeah, I mean, I think United has a lot of potential to add service. I think Delta is going to immediately bulk up in New York and then selectively maybe add 1 or 2 routes that have potential from, I would say, Detroit and Atlanta for connections, Detroit for kind of that origin destination demand. And then I think that Alaska is that last wild card where now that they have 787s coming from their merger with Hawaiian, and they're taking,
yeah.
they're taking delivery of 3 this upcoming year, another 3 or 4 next year. I could definitely see them adding Seattle to Bengaluru or even Seattle to Delhi. And both of those are very, very big markets in their own right. Now, interestingly, in Seattle, Delhi is by far the biggest market, right? It's actually the largest unserved international market from Seattle. And it is the sixth largest international market from Seattle overall. It's bigger than Seattle to Tokyo, Seattle to Seoul, Seattle to Frankfurt, Seattle to Manila, Paris, Amsterdam,
Crazy
bunch
stat.
of,
Wow.
yeah.
Wow. And
And there's a rule of thumb, which is that when a market is unserved and it has that kind of demand profile, once you add nonstop service, typically you're going to see stimulation of between 25 to even 100% of the
absolutely.
total volume. So yeah.
I mean, you'd see stimulation, not just from the VFR perspective, but lots of people who've never had Seattle or Delhi in their bucket list suddenly would be drawn towards the destination, and a direct non-stop flight plays a very important role in that decision making. But then you look at United and you look at American, and you'd see they have already have flights to India. Do you see frequency increasing for those routes, or any other changes?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's really interesting. So I think American has historically sort of struggled with their Indian operations, right? They operated Chicago to Delhi for a long while with the 777. They shifted kind of to JFK to Delhi more recently as part of their attempted kind of build up in the New York market with their sort of Northeast alliance with JetBlue. So truthfully, I don't know, right? Because American, I think strategically is a bit rudderless. They tend to have the weakest long haul franchise. They retired a lot of wide body aircraft during the pandemic. Like they retired a
Yeah.
perfectly good A330 fleet. And so the net result of that is their limited number of 787s are being stretched really, really thin. United, though, I think absolutely is going to bulk up its existing route profile. They had a second daily to India or to Delhi from on the Newark to Delhi market for a while. I think it was either last winter or the winter before. And truthfully, I think in United's case, they're just constrained by 787 delivery availability, right? So they made a huge bet on the 787, if you remember that order for an extra 100 787s.
Yeah.
And they literally don't have enough wide body frames, right? United is the largest long haul international carrier from the US to Asia, to the Middle East, to India, to take your name it, take your pick. And I think it's only a matter of time, right? And obviously Boeing has struggled to deliver 787s reliably, and that has held both American and United back from international expansion. Whereas Delta, obviously, because they went with the Airbus wide body path, right? The A330-900, the A350-900, and now the A350-1000, they are in a little bit better shape when it comes to wide body availability. So I think once United has enough frames, you absolutely will see double daily from Newark to Delhi. I think and then I kind of laid out my predictions for the stuff that they might add hypothetically in a world where Russian airspace was no longer restricted.
We are looking at all these scenarios from a bullish point of view, but let me put my devil's advocate hat on and ask you, what are the anticipated challenges US airlines might face when expanding their operations in India?
Yeah. So I think the pricing pressure from really, I would say more so the Middle Eastern carriers than the European carriers. So right now, a lot of the traffic flows either via the Middle East, that's probably the second biggest sort of market share bucket after Air India, or via Europe. Now, via Europe is actually, I think, not necessarily going to be as much of a headwind because a lot of those carriers are very intertwined with US counterparts, right? So British Airways and Iberia are tied up with American Airlines. The Lufthansa group is tied up with United and Air Canada. The Air France KLM is tied up with Delta, right? So those carriers are even effectively merged across the Atlantic for their transatlantic flows. There's plenty of demand there. So I think the via Europe sort of strategy will kind of, I think, sit as is. But for the Middle East three, right, especially Emirates and Qatar, but even at the Etihad, I think this is one of their bread and butter flows, right? In some ways, the Dubai and Doha and Abu Dhabi, to a lesser extent, hubs were built on taking Indian passengers and funneling them to Europe and to the US. And in today's world, right, if you think about, the US carriers are blocked off from being able to serve most markets. Air India is really your only competition, right? You can fly, and unless you are in Delhi, right? Think about the difference between an Air India connection versus a Dubai connection. Let's just say for a passenger in business class, because that's ultimately who pays for and drives profit on long haul flights. So let's take me, right? I'm someone who flies between the US and India semi-frequently. I was in the country, twice last year, for example. The travel between to travel between Bengaluru, right, where I have some family, and let's say Newark or Chicago, right, as a hypothetical example. Okay, I can fly up to Delhi, at which point during my connection, I will have to. There's no Air India lounge because right now to their credit, I guess they're renovating it, and so I have to go to the quote unquote NCOM lounge, which is perhaps the least calming lounge I think I've ever seen in my entire existence, based on the experiences I've had.
There's a slightly better version which is only for, I think, airline passengers, which are not for credit card customers. But I know what you're saying. Yeah.
Right. Or I can fly via Dubai. I have actually a much better balance between the two flights because it's not just, it's not like 2 hours and then 16 hours. It's maybe like 3 and then 12 if I'm going to the US East Coast, or 4 and then 12. Emirates has obviously a beautiful business class lounge, spanning the entire length of their terminal in Dubai. And, Emirates business class is, depending on the aircraft type, right? It's either, the A380 business class is better than most Air India planes, though now that they have the X Delta frames, they've got the X Etihad and Singapore Airlines frames, it's a little bit better. And obviously their own A350s are beautiful. But the product's going to be better. The service is going to be more consistent, right? So it's not an accident that Emirates and Qatar have won a lot of business here. But in a world where there's way more nonstop options on US carriers, all of a sudden, it's going to come down to, I think, pricing, right? For a lot of them, because if you're going to, right now they mint money, right? It's not that cheap to fly Emirates or Qatar between the US and India, right? It's not what it was 15 years ago or 20 years ago when they were building up this franchise. I think that their ability to charge a premium is going to go away. But the flip side is they obviously have very different cost structures than the US carriers. And that means that I think they're going to try and undercut a lot of this business, particularly if your final destination is Ahmedabad or Kochi or Chennai or Kolkata, some of these cities that wouldn't get nonstop service, Hyderabad, frankly, that wouldn't necessarily get nonstop service from US carriers in all cases.
What would be the advantages or USPs US-based airlines will have to compete against Air India as per you?
So I think it is really interesting, right? Like I think that the US carriers would be largely serving US-based businesses and then the Indian diaspora within the United States, right? Because let's call myself a member of the Indian diaspora, right? I'm obviously sort of second generation, but I have a lot of family and a lot of friends in India, right? So I travel a decent amount between two countries. But India is only going to be one portion of the travel that I do throughout a year, right? So to the degree that I'm loyal to United, right? That's kind of my carrier. I'm a United 1K member. Now, separately, in the last year, my travel has escalated so much, and I'm based in Dallas, such that I'm also American Executive Platinum and on track to be Delta Diamond simultaneously. That's a whole sort of separate bag of tricks. But I'm mostly loyal to United, right? And so to the degree that I'm loyal to United on all my other travel, I'm probably going to default to picking United. Same if my company has obviously a corporate travel policy and I'm traveling on business with United, they're going to capture a lot of the US side market. I think Air India's strength is going to hopefully be, if they can continue to deliver on their quality improvement plan and their restructuring plan, capturing a lot of Indian origin passengers. The trick for Air India, though, is going to be they have to improve what it means to connect in Delhi. Because outside of the isolated cases of Mumbai or Bengaluru, as with the one-off flights to SFO and for both markets, and I believe they also serve Mumbai to Newark or to New York. They have to improve what it means to connect from places like Ahmedabad and Chennai and Kolkata and Hyderabad. Now, depending on the strategy, and I'd actually be curious to hear your sort of take on this. It might make sense to have all three actually as connecting options, right? Because then you have both frequency and timing and convenience from every part of the country covered. But to the degree that they are trying to obviously turn Delhi into their sort of premier hub, they have to improve that connecting experience so that not only can they capture Delhi origin traffic, which will, pick a nonstop, all else being equal, they have to also be able to capture, connecting traffic from the rest of India as a country. And I think they have the potential to, if done correctly, take a lot of market share from the Middle East three carriers, but they have to improve the passenger experience both in flight and within the different airports.
Would you say they would compete against the MEB3 also on the same plank? We know Delta is indeed positioned as a premium carrier, and increasingly United would also like to see itself that way, right?
So I think that United has been investing a lot in its premium product, and it's trying to kind of run that same path as Delta. So I think
Right.
I would actually bucket it as sort of like United and Delta are kind of this like sort of like more premium US carrier group that is going to compete on that basis, plus the strength of the frequent flyer program. I think American and even really Alaska, right, where they are not as established as like premium global airlines for international travel, are going to have a harder time competing, right? Because United has its Polaris lounges, Delta now has its Delta One lounges, right? That is, it's not the same thing as the Emirates Lounge in Dubai, but it is a genuinely pretty premium experience. So American and Alaska, I think, are going to be the ones that have more of a struggle in that competition.
And finally, how do you foresee the future of air travel between the US and India evolving over the next decade, Vinay?
I think it's going to just continue to grow for a lot of those fundamental market factors that I called at the very beginning of this like conversation. But I think the pace of that growth is going to be governed by at what point in the next decade, if at all, do the Russian airspace restrictions get lifted? Because I think once they do, it's sort of a gold rush moment.
Vinay, thank you very much. Loved speaking with you. Fantastic chat with you. Thanks a lot for your time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for inviting me on here. It was a lot of fun to have this conversation.
Always a pleasure to chat with Vinay. Plenty of details about how the India US market works and what should we expect in the coming months and years. Also, what you should expect next week is a special show on the upcoming wide bodies and how important those would be for the India based airlines. Well, that's about it for this week's show. If you enjoyed it, give us a rating on the app of your choice. We stream on all podcast apps. I wish you well and happy flying, my friends.